Today, we're going to focus on the employment situation, aka the monthly jobs report, how data is collected, the differences between various data sets, and challenges faced by the government agencies responsible for these widely used employment reports, and what may be playing a role in unusually large revisions. As our title suggests, the methods may be moldy, but there are no machinations. I'm Aaron Montel, creator of Macro to Mortgage, a 10-year veteran of loan origination and experienced futures and options trader who sees the mortgage landscape through the lens of a trader. I'm joined by Jenny Montel, an economist who has worked with government data for nearly 15 years. Her training as an economist and her experience using and aggregating government data will help us understand the challenges of these agencies and what that no one is cooking the books, so to speak. And yes, she also happens to be my lovely wife. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you for joining today and talking about government employment statistics.
You bet. Thanks for the great introduction. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, just going to do a brief introduction on what exactly we're talking about, which employment numbers. There's lots of employment numbers out there, but we're today specifically focused on what's known as the employment situation, which is released every month by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, which we'll refer to them as a lot today. And it's also just known as the monthly jobs report, but it is also called the employment situation. And they're monthly employment estimates based on responses to two surveys. One is known as the Establishment Survey, also known as the Payroll Survey. And this is a survey of employers asking how many people they're employing. And they ask other questions as well, but we're focusing on the employment question in particular today. And then there's a household survey, also known as the Current Population Survey. This one is conducted by the Census Bureau on behalf of the BLS. And this one, as the name suggests, it is a survey of households, so just people, and asking them a variety of questions, but importantly, whether or not they were employed in the specific reference week that the survey is being conducted. And an important point that we want to emphasize today is that these figures are released early and often to help with decision making. So they really are preliminary estimates and they'll get revised later, which we're going to talk about. But if you really need or want more accuracy, you will want to wait for revisions or use other data sets that aren't based on surveys but are actual counts, such as the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages data, also known as QCEW or CEW data, which also comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but uses different methods and measures a different set of employees. And we're going to go into all of that today.
So what you're saying basically is that there's a trade-off to have these figures early and often means that they're not going to be their best the first time out, right? So
That's exactly it, Aaron.
there's a trade-off there, and not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but to steal the title from our next slide, I believe, is that these revisions, they're kind of a feature. They're not a bug, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Because they're survey based, then some, in particular, we'll get into this, but there's several reasons why they're not their best in their first release. And one of them just has to do with the number of responses to the survey that come in by the time that the BLS wants to publish these numbers. So it is by design. They're getting the numbers out fast because that's what we as the public want. People want those numbers quickly, or a lot of the people do. And so the BLS says, sure, we'll give them to you quickly, but you need to know what that comes with, that trade-off, exactly what you said, Aaron.
And to be clear, since we're talking about two different surveys that kind of get merged together for the full monthly report, the household and the establishment, as you pointed out, the household survey is a rolling sample set, so they achieve their goal, which is about 60,000 households every month. And they get pretty close to that every single month. So, because they get their goal, when they first before in order to release the first figures on the household side, at least, there are no revisions there. And because the unemployment rate comes from the household survey, that's why you never see the unemployment rate being revised, right?
That's exactly right, Aaron. And so the establishment survey, on the other hand, does undergo revisions. It
Yeah.
has two monthly revisions in the 2 months after following the initial release, and then one annual benchmark revision. And they call it a benchmark revision because the data get benchmarked to those QCEW data that I mentioned earlier. So the monthly revisions are based on additional survey responses. So just more responses come in, and so the numbers get revised, the model gets rerun based on the additional data. And then the annual revision benchmarks the estimates to the QCEW data. And why they do that is because the QCEW data are actual employment counts from administrative records, in particular IRS records or W-2 forms. And so they're not survey based, they're not estimates, they're actual counts. So QCEW data are more complete for the workers it covers, and that's an important caveat. So it just covers, even though it's a full count, it's just a full count of W-2 employees. So QCEW data exclude any employees that aren't covered by federal unemployment insurance. So this includes railroad workers, military employees, some farm employees, and a handful of others. But most importantly for our topic of today, huge exclusion are undocumented workers and proprietors. All
Mhm.
proprietors, whether documented or not, are excluded. And in proprietors include sole proprietors, partnerships, and tax exempt cooperatives. That's how proprietors are defined. And so the CEW data exclude all proprietors, documented and undocumented, and all undocumented workers because they won't have a W-2 form.
Got it.
And
Okay.
this will be important for what we're going to talk about in the coming slides. Sorry, Aaron, you were going
Yeah,
to
I was
say.
just gonna also add to, and this was about a thought ago, but the establishment survey with 119,000 establishments roughly every month surveyed, there's no mandate in most states. There's a handful of states where there's a mandate for establishments to respond to those surveys, but in the majority of states, it is completely voluntary, which probably also is a bit of a challenge.
Very good point. Exactly.
Okay.
Well said. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so as we said, revisions are definitely a feature, not a bug. They're always going to happen. However, they have gotten larger recently, so they've gotten a little more press, if you will, and maybe have some concerns have risen because of this. So we're going to talk about three reasons why revisions have gotten larger recently, and none of them have anything to do with collusion. We've got falling survey response rates, um, and we've had recent surges in immigration and in gig work, and they all affect the size of revisions. So we're going to talk about each of those next.
And to your point, survey response rates, this chart comes directly from the BLS and shows the decline in establishment survey response rates as of the first release, so prior to any revisions, from nearly 80% just before the pandemic to 47% back in October 2024, which is the most recent data. Various hypotheses are out there about why this is, including survey fatigue, which I think we all probably feel at some point when everybody's asking us to fill out surveys. Also, there's some mistrust of surveyors and/or government, which are, makes sense. It could be playing a role.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And to point out, this is a global phenomenon
that's
and
right.
also across various types of surveys. So it's not just the BLS that's having trouble with this.
That's right. That's right.
And the reason that this affects revision size is that the fewer responses there are to a survey, the less representative that sample of respondents is going to be of the entire US population. So if non respondents tend to be similar to one another in systematic ways or are distinct from responders in systematic ways, this will introduce unintentional bias into the estimates. So respondents' unique characteristics will be overrepresented than would be expected in the general population. Now, non-response bias, which is what this is called, exists in every single survey. And there are strategies to limit and correct for it, and the BLS does apply those strategies. It's just that non-response bias is exasperated the lower the
Mm,
response rates.
right.
And the fewer responses, it just means that your estimates are really more modeled. Those modeled estimates are based on less hard data. And so there's just more burden on the statistical model used to extrapolate the sample to the entire population. Therefore, there's going to be larger revisions as more
Mhm.
responses come in and the model is rerun.
These are all modeled, right? There's no way that they're going to survey every adult human being in the United States, so they have to employ statistical models.
That's exactly right,
Yeah,
because if they wanted to count everybody like the census, the data won't come out till 2 years after the census is conducted, which often happens, right?
right, right.
So the data get more dated, more old, the more accurate you want them to be.
Yeah,
So that is that trade-off that you
the
mentioned right
trade-offs.
now.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
All right, the second reason we want to talk about is immigration. Now, it is likely that both of the surveys, the establishment survey and the household survey, include at least some undocumented immigrants because these surveys ask about employment status, not legal status. So when they go to an employer and say, how many people did you employ this week? That's all they ask is a number. They're not asking anything about legal or not legal. And so when the employer ideally responds with the full number, and then therefore those undocumented workers would be included. And same with a household. When they call a household and ask if the person worked that week or not, they're not asking anything about legal status. So they probably include some.
And
And oh, go
yeah,
ahead, Aaron.
I was going to butt in here real quick. Some people might ask, well, why are we including undocumented people in our
Mm,
count of employees? And I think the answer is pretty simple. It's that, documented or undocumented, uh, those adults live in a community. They have employment, they're earning an income, and they're spending that income, presumably in that community, right? So they have an economic impact on wherever it is that they're living. So they ought to be counted.
exactly. It's whether they should or should not be working here. And whatever your feelings on that are, that doesn't matter for the
That's
survey. We're trying to get a count. We're trying to understand the economic activity happening in the US,
that's right.
and so they're very important to include because they are part of the economic engine.
Perfect.
Exactly right. One other thing to note is that employment associated with new businesses that don't get captured in the establishment survey, they're estimated. So BLS does try to account for them, employees of these new businesses, using past QCEW data on the number of employees per establishment in that industry and region. So if they know that a new business came in a particular industry, in a particular state, they can look back at recent QCEW data and say, oh, that industry in the state employs on average this many people per establishment. And so they'll apply that ratio to this new business and get an employment estimate for that business.
What you're describing is called the birth death model, right?
That's exactly right.
So basically, just to make sure that I understand, if someone starts a delivery business, um, and that gets picked up by the data, someone then looks at that and says, "Hey, according to past historic data, QCEW data, a delivery business on average employs 5 people.
Mhm.
So we'll make the assumption that this new delivery business employs 5 people. And conversely, if we see that that delivery business or a delivery business has ceased to function, has gone out
Mhm.
of business, they'll then say same thing. On average, a delivery business employs 5 people. So we'll say that 5 people are no longer employed because this delivery business is now out of business. Is that accurate?
That's it.
Okay. Okay.
Just like that. Yeah. Um, And so, why this matters is that the QCEW data to which these survey based estimates are benchmarked once a year does not include undocumented workers or proprietors, as we mentioned
Mm,
in the beginning. So, its value as a benchmark is diminished during periods of high and variable immigration, like we have seen recently. So, its benchmark process, the BLS's benchmark process, is really based on an assumption of slow and steady immigration. And so that's kind of gotten, I don't know if messed up is the right word, but it looks like the benchmarking process maybe needs some tweaking at
some
this point.
tweaking. Yeah.
Mhm.
So again, whatever you think of immigration, the fact is that it's occurred, and we just need to account for it.
You got it.
Yeah. Okay.
And so the most recent benchmark revision this last summer implied a larger than typical downward revision of over 800,000 jobs. And that caused some consternation and, questioning. And it is likely that that downward revision was too big because those survey based estimates can include undocumented workers and proprietors, but they're being benchmarked to a data set that doesn't include those. And again, this is the consequence of that surging immigration and just not the benchmarking process not accounting for that.
I want to mention one thing that I think maybe some folks aren't aware of, but in most states, an immigrant can create an LLC, create a business entity, and apply for an EIN, which is an IRS employee identification number for that business. They can then work through that business, and as a matter of fact, a lot of employees do so, or a lot of immigrants do rather. So
Mhm.
there's likely quite a bit of immigrant work, documented and undocumented, happening through the creation of LLCs across the country, and they can go out and they can bid on jobs if they're delivery drivers or construction workers or whatever trade they have, and they can get paid. and um, but because of that, because of the way they're doing it, they're being missed, potentially being missed by the QCEW.
That's exactly right, Aaron.
Yeah.
And one thing we didn't mention yet is that proprietors can also include, they don't have to be a small business owner per se, they can be a contractor. So contract
That's
workers
right.
also are going to be considered proprietors and be included in the surveys, but not in QCEW data. So,
Got it.
and that kind of brings us to the next topic, which is increased gig work, because these folks are considered proprietors if they're filling out a 1099 for this work. And Aaron, you pulled up this figure from the National Bureau of Economic Research
Yeah.
showing the growth in gig workers recently. And wow, what a jump we saw right during the pandemic, which is no surprise to anyone listening, I'm sure. And the BLS does try to capture the gig workforce through the contingent worker supplement in the household survey. And that's a new supplement because this surge in gig work. Now, oh,
I was to say, I mean, yeah, they meaning the BLS are trying to get a better handle on reading gig work, because it's become, as as this chart shows, it's become pretty prevalent, and also it's probably fairly obvious, but worth mentioning that somebody can be a full-time W-2 employee and also a gig worker.
yes,
Yeah.
indeed. Well said.
Okay.
And this is just another graphic from a different data source to kind of reemphasize the point about increased gig work. This is from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. They have a data set called the Regional Economic Accounts, and it's one of the only sources of complete proprietor counts, excuse me. And so this includes all the types of proprietors that exist in the US. And this graph is the percentage change in proprietor counts. So you can see that in 2020, 2021, and 2022, these were pretty historically high percent growth in proprietors
So,
relative to past kind of averages.
so to make sure that I'm understanding, this is basically saying that in those 3 years you mentioned, 2020, 21, 22, that each of those years saw a 7% increase in people who became proprietors or business owners or contractors or worked in some way that wasn't a W-2 type job.
Exactly. And so, just like the surge in undocumented business owners and workers, the surge in gig workers makes the current benchmarking process just less effective because the CEW data aren't including these proprietors. And so, when we benchmark survey based data that has a lot of immigrants and gig workers in it, or maybe not a lot, but some, and growing, and we are trying to benchmark it to a data set that doesn't include any of them, it just is throwing that benchmarking process off. And hence greater revisions. And
This
maybe too
seemed
big of revisions.
Yeah, this seems like a pretty big shift,
Yes.
right? This seems like a pretty big shift and probably having an impact on the data. Like
Yep.
how could it not?
And the folks at VLS, and we're going to talk about this in a future episode, but they are some of the smartest people we have, and they really are dedicated to doing good work. And they may revise these methods eventually, but these are kind of new surges, and so the current methodologies just aren't working as well as they used to work. Is what's
But
going on.
I mean, you're a data scientist, so that's kind of how this works, right? There's an evolution of the process of gathering and processing data. There has to be improvements.
Yep, because the economy is changing, the world is changing, and as it
Yeah,
changes, it just takes a little while for us to adjust to those changes.
yeah, well said. So the key takeaways, there's three. It's that uh, each employment measure includes different categories of employees. So comparing these reports to one another is not really an apples to apples comparison, right?
Mm.
And hopefully, now knowing a little bit more about each of these data sets will help folks draw a more informed conclusion, and not only draw a more informed conclusion, but discount opinions of those who unknowingly attempt to compare these reports to one another,
Hmm.
because it's kind of hard to compare these things directly to one another because they are quite different when you look under the hood. Also, there's a lot of noise in all of these reports, which is why personally, I think it's more valuable to look at trends. 3 6 month trends I think are going to be more valuable than looking at one report, digging into the December BLS report and digging for the details. I think you're probably better served to look at a 3 or 6 month trend. And um, the benchmarking process, as I think you did a
Well,
really good
and just
job. Yeah,
before you moved on a little quickly there, but the reason is because well, there's many reasons, but
yeah,
some reasons are that any given month's values could be affected by things like natural disasters and strikes and government shutdowns, all things
that's
that we've experienced recently. So those things, if you're going to look at monthly numbers, you really need to pay attention to what else has been going on
yeah,
that might affect those.
thank you for making that point. That's a really important one because even just recently, as you mentioned, there was a jobs report that followed the series of hurricanes that went across Florida that was very low and has since been revised upward. But
Hmm.
there was a lot of noise in that first issue because of things that happened. So thank you for that. Also, you mentioned, and I think you did a really good job. The benchmarking process, it does appear to need some tweaking. The world and environment has changed, and the model probably needs to be tweaked to keep up with those changes and more accurately reflect what's going on. And finally, and maybe most important, is the idea that the idea that these employment reports have been manipulated in some way for a political agenda has absolutely no supporting evidence. Understanding the nuances and complexity of these reports is and how they interact with one another, not just them individually, but they do interact with one another. So, in understanding all of those things sheds a lot of light on the process. And the process clearly, as we've said, needs to be tweaked, but also it shuts the door on the conspiracy theories, I think, pretty 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 forcefully, as it should.
Agreed and well said.
Guys. Well, Jay, thank you for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. We appreciate it. And if you have comments, please leave your comments below on the platform, and like and subscribe to this video. Thanks so much.